Well, if I may first, if I could be serious just for a second. Since our last taping, God spoke to me. And said that a few people watching this on cable within the next week did not send me $6,700 that I would die. Well, all right. It wasn't God, it was the guy that runs the cable company here where we tape it. And it wasn't $6,700, it was, well, for production, we owe them $64.70 for some production costs that they said. As regards some of what we've been talking about, more or less, just to pretend that this is abiding by the recognized laws of continuity and common sense, the comfort of old ideas, the reliance upon dead ideas, the reliance upon external authority, which is always dead and comfortable. There's always no one there to take your call. You can call, you can call up religion and say, may I speak to God, but they're not going to put you through. You can call up a university and you can say, let me speak to the world's smartest man, and he will not be there, or else they won't admit it. The external sources of authority, the point is, there is no one there to take your call, or they cannot become comfortable, they cannot become external sources of authority. The only thing that amounts to anything in life is something that's dead. Now, we've been through that, and I'm sure everyone understands that that is a more blatant, but what the hell, telling of the fact that anything that works in life doesn't work, which is why it works. It's why it continues, because if it worked, it would be absolutely suicidal. But in line with all of that, I thought it was about time to consider, Kyroots brought it up and forced our hand, considering the triaxial dance again, that in a three-dimensional world, such as this appears to be, anytime something is going on, all the way from earthquakes to revision in the tax code to you thinking, you are dealing with three directions going on at once. You're dealing with three forces going on at once. You're dealing with what amounts to literally a triaxial dance. And the three forces, since we haven't mentioned it in a long time, I think could be renamed. If you consider it this way, this is getting much more subtle and direct, but after all this time, you should be able to do it, because after all, it's now late in the afternoon and we have already missed the signing of the Magna Carta. We found out 12:15, so we're out, we missed it. If you considered that which runs life, if you considered the three forces as to be the regenerative, the dying, and the uninvolved. The uninvolved, of course, is always the tricky one. The easy one, months ago, on another channel at another time, Kyroots and I and some of you simply just put it point blank, like shooting with a real cheap Saturday night special. See, this is getting more like maybe a 12 gauge that fires croissants. Please don't ask for clarification. I don't know. But rather than point blank of just saying constructive and destructive forces, which is, of course, a little improvement over the ordinary idea of good and evil and gods and anti-gods, always appearing to be a struggle all the way from Confucius and Zarathustra on up to modern day New Age and those attempting to work on the Senate Select Committee on tax revisions. Still believe that two things are running this country, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now the world, good and evil, God and Satan, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, or as that fellow saw in the Kyroots tonight, I thought about wrapped it up. That was just my personal opinion. But I paid good money for that personal opinion, and I would like to use it. That there's always the dual forces running all of the universe. The forces of good and the forces of vanilla. I know that some of you are waiting for a revision of that. There would be the forces of chocolate and the forces of evil, but you can do that yourself. Rather than just call it constructive and destructive, and then the uninvolved, anybody walking around that can think would agree that no matter what was called, they'd say, yes, there are two forces going on, and even if I'm not religious, even if I'm not philosophical, there are at least two forces, as they might attribute to my old equation, remember, of I plus not I, which is not that far removed, because they can say, yes, there are two forces running life. What I want and everybody else is getting in my way. That's the two forces running life. You could look upon that, if there was such a thing as Alabama theology. You could replace the ideas of the struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil with the forces of what I want and the forces that won't give me credit. They won't take a post-dated check. They won't give me a good trade-in. It's me, the forces of goodness and decency and truth and justice, and the forces of everybody else who mainly are a bunch of peckerwoods. They won't see the light. But then if you said to such a person, all the way from this Alabama theologian to the Pope, and all philosophers and everyone in between, if you insisted in some way, if you just insisted, listen, at any given time, we could stop and say that the forces of good and evil cannot account for everything. There's other things going on. Pick any example, no matter how blatant it may seem to you, that here are decent forces and indecent forces. And there's a struggle. If I went along with you and said, okay. But look, there are things not involved with that example. What are you going to call them? It is extremely, and it's not philosophical, it's not academic, it is not even at the ordinary level a matter of intelligence. It's a matter of the limitations of the 3D world. Because if you try and consider, all right, there are two things pushing everything, pulling everything. There is a dance, there is a battle, there is a struggle, there is some kind of conflict, there is some kind of balance. And no matter what they pick out, though, and you say, well, wait a minute, there are things that are not involved with your example. And you'd have to go, yeah, you're right. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And of course, then they want to leave town. They want to drop the subject. But if you say, wait, what are we going to call the rest? How do you account for it? They could just go. Or they could say, well, call it anything you want to. And then we could go along with what I just did and say, well, all right, won't we call it the uninvolved? And or man can say, hey, call it that. Call it chicken fat for all I care. It doesn't matter. Because as you pointed out, you caught me for a second. I'm talking for the ordinary person. You caught me for a second saying, well, how about all the areas not involved with what I just pointed out of a particular struggle between goodness and non-goodness? And for a while, there for a second, you had me like I thought it was something important. But you're right. If it's a struggle between a poor old lady having her house repossessed by an evil banker, if it's an honest person walking down the street minding their own business and they get mugged by a drunken, crazed, drug-driven, ne'er-do-well, then there is an example of goodness against evil. And let's assume that we were in civilized territory, and you're not going to stand up and say, well, let me say a good word for drunken, drug-crazed muggers. You'd have to say, all right, you're right, there's an example. But how about this? What are we going to say about the Canadian Football League? What are we going to say about the Winter Olympic Games? What are we going to say about all of the people who are attempting to put clothes on the animals in Nigeria? And at first the person could go, well, wait a minute. All right, wait a minute. All right, wait a minute. You're right, that doesn't have anything to do with that example. But you're not saying that my example of a drug-crazy, drunken person attacking a poor old widow woman, you're not saying that that is not a struggle between good and evil. I'll go back to playing you. And I say, no, I wasn't arguing that. I'm just saying that given that your scenario, your example is, by any decent explanation, a struggle between good and evil, what are we going to call everything else? And then we back to playing an ordinary person. I go, well, you had me there for a second. Because you're right. As pressing as that seemed to be. And of course, we can make it really personal and anecdotal, that his mother, this guy, got mugged, or he got mugged, on the way to temple, carrying money to help the building fund, and somebody jumped out and hit him and took his money. Now there is a battle between good and evil. I was trying to do good, and an evil person took it. And even when he left, I heard him laughing, saying, I'll take this and buy drugs and become a drug-crazed person again. And so we say, all right, and I'm speaking for you, and we say, all right, you're correct. What else can we call that but some kind of example of a struggle between good and evil? Now we're back to ordinary person. They say, all right, so you agreed, but now this crap about putting clothes on animals and what's going on with the Canadian Football League, are they still in business? Whatever the hell that means, for a minute, you had me going. But wait a minute, so what? I'm talking for ordinary people. It has nothing to do with this. Okay, sir. It has nothing to do with your anecdotal example of the struggle between good and evil. Yes. But that doesn't make it go away. Well, no, but it's irrelevant. What did we used to call the third force sometime? The irrelevant. Tell an ordinary person that, and they'd go, this is getting too weird even for me. I think I'll go back and finish my doctoral work on Lewis Carroll. But as some of you at one time glimpsed, if you take that kind of description of there being a triaxial dance, that at any juncture when anything is going on, from you thinking to you whining, to a person feeling compassion, to a person trying to drive down the street, to political parties trying to split up into new factions, no matter what's going on, if you could see in a more complex way, without any doubt, instead of you seeing, well, there are two forces going on, you got to face up to it. I'll do a little piece of dramatic sarcasm. Hey, it takes a boy genius to see that, right? There are two forces going on. Hey, how long it take you to go to school? How many drugs do you have to take to come to this great insight? All right? People have seen that for 6,000 years. Those drawings on the cave walls in France, they're not all buffaloes and hunters. It's them going, it takes two forces to make everything work. I mean, there's how up to date you are to go, yes, I can see that. That won't do it. What you do not see, but the only reason it's possible is that's all you can see at the ordinary level. That's why it can go on, if you recall the Kyroots from tonight. But instead of you seeing good and evil, or the conservatives and the liberals fighting over the political control of the parties in Italy, or seeing a decent person walking down the street on the way to church and an indecent person waiting to rob them, instead of that, there's a third one. I don't have another hand available here in this dimension, but there would be another one, see here. And it would be an intersection of three different forces. That's the only way that's possible. If for no other way to look at it, there could not be the two that seem to be involved with the obvious dance, the undeniable struggle, the undeniable situation. Were it not for the background, you could not see two people dancing unless you could see a dance floor, unless you could see the back of the ballroom, unless you could see the band. You cannot pluck out Tom and Jerry out of a cartoon without the background. You cannot have Barney and whatever the hell, Fred Flintstone. They do not exist. They don't exist. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't. I almost gave myself the blues. They can't exist without the background. If for no other way, even though I guess that sounds a little funny, that is the fact. Holy Writ, the descriptions throughout the ages of the great struggles between good and evil and progress and involution cannot exist without a background. You cannot write down the history of man without there being a piece of paper. If you're going to write down, well, I'm going to go put down the struggle between good and evil. I'm not going to list the irrelevant. I'm going to call my manuscript having two eyes as opposed to that sucker Homer trying to write a book of one eye. I got two eyes, and in my book, I'm going to put down the real history of man. And the only thing I'm going to put down is what amounted to anything. I'm not going to put down something about the phony baloney Canadian Football League. They don't even know how to keep score. They don't forget that. I'm not going to put something down about Aristophanes' brother. I mean, hell, I can just barely stand his plays. Much less, his brother was a real hack. So I'm only going to put down, in my pages of history, will only be the important stuff. Not just the good stuff, not just the bad stuff, But the important stuff, fine. You understand? I'm not going to put down any of this irrelevant baloney. Gotcha. But notice, and this is not just plain words, you have got to have a background. If you're going to write down just the important stuff, just the A stuff, just the B stuff, just the good stuff, just the bad stuff, just the constructive stuff, just the destructive, all right? But you got to have a blank piece of paper to write it on. Barney and Fred cannot exist until somebody draws the background. Of course, that's still, after doing all that, and we've done almost this before, I know. But the ordinary mind would still go, yeah, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying, but so what? And of course, so what is almost a name for the third force. It really is. If you get that good, it's to go ahead and say, all right, I can see, there's no doubt. Call it good, call it evil, call it chocolate, call it vanilla. Call it my upper lip, my lower lip. Right brain, left brain. That's right. It's there. It is not just literarily, environmentally induced. Because it seems to be something in our genes almost. But the history of man is replete. Whatever the hell that means. Well, that was when they had trousers that were plain front. But it is nothing but a continual history. Philosophically, spatially, militarily, between forces that appear to be good, ideas that were good, movements that seem to be good or tried to be good, and those that were just despicable. We can't see any redeeming quality. And yet there's all this other stuff that doesn't seem to mean anything. And if I was an ordinary mind, I'd say, all right, I agree, there is. At any particular time, there is. And you're calling that another force. And on your behalf, I go, yes, we are. They could almost name it themselves. They could say, okay, but so what? But you understand, without the so what, the other two can't work. The dance, I was trying to get you to refine your view of it. Or the forces are really between a more souffled version, would be between the regenerative, the dying, and the uninvolved. And at the ordinary level, this goes on. It's not just a revolutionary thing. You can see it, and I was going to try to get you to consider that this is another working description of how the mind operates ordinarily. Is that this dance between those three forces goes on and in a sense is identified in life. Not in the way in which we're describing it. But it's this, and it's almost a touch of the rebellion. In that, like the Kyroots was pointing out, is many, many people. Well, he said many. Many people have suspected what's going on, but damn few really want to know. Which is a cheap way of putting it, because all those that suspected, if they heard that, we could pull them out of the graves and out of the libraries, and if they heard that and for some reason it impressed them, and they heard many people have suspected what's going on, but damn few really want to know. And if they were some of the ones that suspected what's going on, they would all begin to jump up and squeal and go, no, I really want to know. And they would be telling the truth. But the truth has nothing to do with a Kyroot. The truth shall not nip away at the heels of a Kyroots. There is, what I started to say, that there is a kind of routine regeneration that goes on in life, because life is growing, life is expanding. And what it amounts to is a kind of mechanical rebellion. It's almost a little piece of a seditious affair. But we'd have to call it a kind of mechanical, blind rebellion. But what it amounts to is this regeneration that goes on in life is continually pushing in just a mechanical way against the dying force. Which again, I won't go into, but you can fill it in yourself if you don't see it, which is the struggle between the conservatives and the liberals, between an old generation and a young generation, between the old man and the kid. And it's not just that the younger generation wants to kill the old one. It's not just that new ideas, now we're talking about in the ordinary world, they're just new ideas, new schools of art, new fashion. But just consider the generation, the new city generation always coming in. They are actually trying to revive the dying one. That's why they dance. That's why the picture I suggest to you is apt. Because the new generation is not trying to kill the old one. If that was it, then I would have suggested you the better title would have been something like the new force, or the attacking force and the attacked force, or the new force and the old force, and forget about the third one for a minute. But it would be on the basis that the new ideas, new generations are coming in, and they're always trying to wipe out the old. You can say that. All right, say that. Remember. Okay, now forget it. I mean, that's child's play. That's back to good and evil. Because it's really it's a mechanical, low-level, extended form of a revolution. Because by the dance, the regenerative force is not trying to kill the dying force. Why would it be dancing with it? It'd let it lay there and die. It is almost a kind of mechanical rebellion. But the rebellion is in this sense. The regenerative force is trying to revive the dying force. But this revision is of a particular kind. It is an attempt to revive it via correction and modification. Which is back to the segue of old ideas. The comfort. The reality that you cannot make up an imaginary animal. All you can do is try and correct an old one, modify an old one. So it's not that one force is trying to kill another. That's child's play. I mean, that is back to the crudest form of intellectual chemistry, because all that is, no matter what you try to call it, all that is the belief in gods and demons. The other good guys are fighting the bad ones, and they're trying to kill each other, especially the bad guys. The bad gods trying to kill the good ones. No, they're not. One force is not trying to kill another. That is absolutely suicidal. It is a kind of low-level rebellion actually going on. The regenerative force is dancing continually with the dying force. And there's always a force dying. Just as there's always people dying. Just as one generation gets replaced by another. Just as one crop this year is harvested and dies. And you know all those pictures are older than we are. But it's not that the new crop is trying to kill the old one. It's not that the new ideas, the regenerative force, is trying to kill the old one. Nay, nay. The old one's already dying. Remember the names I was suggesting to you. The new one for the time being. The regenerative, the dying, and the uninvolved. The dying force is always here. It's not just one force you're dying. Sometimes you're trying to keep something else from dying. Sometimes you're trying to keep something in you from dying. But the dance goes on, and it's a very low level. That is low level. It's so extended that it's meaningless to one man's lifetime. The regenerative force, the operation of this kind of regeneration, is the regenerative force trying to revive the dying force. It doesn't know why, it doesn't know how. That's why I say it's a kind of mechanical rebellion. But it's trying to revive it on the basis of modifying it, correcting it, which leads to this, that the ordinary mind on the collective level is always after, it's a kind of renaissance, it's always after a rebirth, not a new birth. A new birth would be the revolution. And it sounds the same at first, I'm not just being funny though. But they continue to talk about it. A rebirth in science, a rebirth in religion, a rebirth in our culture, a rebirth in our national pride. Whatever it is at some local city level. But it is a kind of rebellion. It is a kind of awareness that signifies the health of collective humanity, that every generation is finding fault with the last one. And I'm, of course, spraying it out because you can sit there and find fault with yourself. You can find fault with somebody 2 years older than you are, 2 hours older than you are. It's going on continually. It's the health of humanity. But you are not trying to kill the old one. That's a crude view. I mean, you can take it, and there's been historical sites made. Ordinary people that said that's exactly what's going on. Is one idea is trying to kill off an old one once we have better information, once we have improved data. That's not the way life works. The dance continues to go on. If something actually dies, it's forgotten. Nobody's worried about it's going to die. If you're dead, nobody worries about your health. Nobody discusses, well, does he still look as dead as he did yesterday? Yes. The health of the deceased is not discussed. But there's always a force dying compared to some other force. There's always an idea that is dying compared to another one. But the one that apparently is the second in my description. That is, that one force, one idea, seems to be dying. It seems to be on the ropes. Things are looking bad. It may take a year. It may take 10 years, according to where you're standing, how high up on a hill. It could be going hundreds of years. But apparently, this idea, this movement, this people, this religion, this nationality is in trouble. Things do not look good. But that doesn't matter. If it's just dying, it's still alive. And if people are still talking about it, it's still alive. See, the dead can be revived, if you notice that Kyroot tonight. Forget metaphysics and religion. No, that's just all dreams. I'll tell you a fact, an observable fact. The dead can be revived. If they couldn't, we wouldn't have a secondary world. So if you're talking about it, it can be revived. The regenerative force is trying to revive it. That's what makes a sequence. That's what makes a transition. But it tries to revive it without knowing how or why, but on the basis of not actually creating a new birth. That'd be a revolution. What it's trying to do is a rebirth. The Renaissance. It sounds like a great thing. It sounds like a great thing historically when you put a capital R on it and talk about, 1500. Sounds great. And it sounds even great in a personal life. I guess I would like an intellectual renaissance within myself. Think about it. Not a rebirth. All that'd do is drag back your old ideas and prop them up. Hey, put some more makeup on that dead man. Make it, he doesn't look as good, as fresh as he did yesterday. You can doctor it up. You don't believe that? Look how old the religions are that people are still out dying for and paying money for. All of that's an attempted rebirth. This kind of stuff, whatever this kind of stuff is, would be an actual new birth. And it's too drastic. It does not happen out on the dance floor where you can see it. Don't forget. I forgot. God said 24 hours. That's the main thing. Or else. How much was I said? 75? 7,500. In 24 hours. Well, 48. Get to the post office.